Hello, it's John Heaton. This afternoon, I thought I'd have a discussion on the Beatles as musicians and how they complemented each other musically, or not, as the case may be, over the time when they were together. So I think the first thing I would say is the chemistry between the four Beatles musically is evident, and the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, should I say. I think that's very true with the Beatles. And it was George Martin who said to one of the engineers who was just starting at Abbey Road in 68, around 68, saying, if there's one Beatle in the room, great, fantastic. 2, brilliant. 3, even better. But when you get 4 of them in the room at one time, this undescribable aura is present, and musically in particular, I guess he was saying. So anyway, over the years one has countless examples of how John complemented Paul or vice versa. Obviously in the vocal harmonies, their voices blended very well together, but also the way John played a superb rhythm guitar, for example on All My Loving, 64, and then George Harrison coming up with that beautiful acoustic line in And I Love Her, and that little 4-note line becomes the hook of the entire song, and Paul conceded this in a recent interview. Countless other examples, and also I would counter the argument that towards the end of their career they became session men for each other. Maybe to some extent, meaning that they weren't creating stuff together so much as they had been in the early days, or even on Pepper. But that's not to say that one of them couldn't bring something essential to the other one's song. I was thinking of an example like Sexy Sadie, where if you hear the demo, it's not a brilliant track, and then I guess it was must have been Paul's idea, I assume so, to put a piano track on that song, and it lifts that song from being somewhat mediocre to being a bit of a classic. So very nice contribution from Paul on that track. And then one thinks of Paul's effervescent runaway bass line on Hey Bulldog, almost the highlight of the song. I mean, it's just, that is a song where all 4 Beatles are on top form, and as people have said many times over the years, Ringo may not be technically the best drummer on the planet, but he was the best drummer for the Beatles. And you didn't need a Keith Moon on drums for the Beatles. You needed someone who kept the beat and went off on the tom-toms occasionally, and had a unique style. And when other drummers have tried to imitate Ringo on Day in the Life, for example, or Come Together, it's not easy, because it's this strange kind of mixture of left hand and right hand that Ringo has, which makes him so unique. Couple of things, and then there's loads of examples over the years where they've obviously complemented each other musically. Too many to go into, but maybe you just mention a couple, like Taxman, George's song, already a great song, but Paul's bass line and his lead guitar break, just absolutely brilliant components of the overall track. And even on the later years, the very last album they cut together, Abbey Road, Come Together is just a tour de force group recording, and Paul's swampy piano lick is amazing, and his effervescent bass playing is just one of his all-time best bass lines ever, and playing George on guitar is just a brilliant performance. I Want You, She's So Heavy. Similarly, Paul is very adventurous on the bass, and to great effect. Even on that album, Maxwell Silver Hammer, which George Harrison maybe didn't care for, allegedly, he contributed some very tasteful Moog synthesizer to that track. So on the whole, I would say they were really gunning for each other and trying to bring out the best of each other in terms of the material, whoever's song it was. The others would rally round. I've got a few examples of where perhaps that wasn't the case, which I'll mention. Across the Universe was recorded in February '68 and was so unsatisfactory to John and the others that they left it on the shelf for more than a year and a half. And it would eventually surface on Let It Be and also on a charity album, December '69. But I think it's one example where the Beatles could have made more of that track, done more of a group performance. I know John felt that in the Playboy interviews that an air of looseness would materialise when they were working on his songs, and he almost called it subconscious plagiarism, or Paul subconsciously trying to, should I not plagiarism, subconscious sabotage, which I don't really believe, but I think Across the Universe was a fairly lacklustre session, and maybe all of them were just not in the mood that day, but they could have come back the next day or the following days and worked on it more. To go outside the steps of Abbey Road and get two fans to come and sing the backing vocal was a little bit lazy and doesn't work very well. But anyway, this is a very rare occurrence, and but I will mention the other couple. All Things Must Pass was worked on in the Let It Be sessions, and for some reason the Beatles couldn't make a good fist of it, and very sloppily played, and John was not into it at all, Paul was not into it, and poor old George must have felt quite disheartened, because it turned out to be one of the best solo tracks of his career when it appeared as the title track on All Things Must Pass. It's an absolutely majestic number, and the Beatles must have seen the potential in it as a demo, could have worked on it, but I guess by that time they just pretty fed up with each other, so maybe that's the reason. And similarly on Long and Winding Road, John's bass playing is a little bit loose and a couple of wrong notes, but again that probably reflects the boredom of the period more than anything else, I think. And then we have George's claim that Paul wouldn't let him play guitar, which again I find a little bit hard to believe. I think it must have been more a perception than anything else, because basically Paul, if he'd written a song, he could decide which bits of guitar go here and there, other than to have a solo, which may have been the obvious thing to do in some tracks. An example such as George wanting to play a guitar line after each line of Hey Jude, I think that's up to Paul to say yes or no to, and he said no. And George apparently was upset by that, but maybe it would have been interesting to hear that version with George trying to do what he planned, but I think it's fair to say it wasn't a very good idea. I can't really imagine it, but anyway. I don't know. Maybe Paul was an oppressive presence and a little bit bossy in the studio, but George contributes some beautiful guitar to a lot of Paul's songs and a lot of John's songs. And Paul plays beautiful bass on George's track Something, for example, and on Old Brown Shoe. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is the Beatles as a live band. They've always been criticised as a live band, mainly because a lot of the audiences who came to see them were screaming too loudly, and so the Beatles couldn't hear themselves. But that's not really their fault. And Keith Richards of the Stones keeps on maintaining that the Stones are a better live band than the Beatles. And then he says, somewhat provocatively, ask George Harrison, he'll tell you. Well, George was always slagging off the Beatles, and I don't know, it just seems a bit ludicrous. I mean, I think it's fair to say that from '65 onwards the Beatles couldn't really hear themselves performing live, and hence maybe were not that strong as a live unit, although the Hollywood Bowl tapes, which have come out recently remastered, show a good tight little band. But if you really want the real Beatles live sound, you should probably go back to Hamburg at their peak, in '61 and early '62, and if you could substitute Ringo on drums, because he didn't join until later '62, you'd probably have the Beatles at their peak as a live band, and certainly Lennon thought so. And unfortunately, the tapes from those sessions don't really exist in brilliant quality, so we'll never know. But eyewitnesses say that they were just electric on stage in Hamburg. And by the time they went on the first theatre tour of Liverpool, as John said, the edges had been knocked off and they all got into suits and cleaned up. But I don't think it's fair to say that for the Stones to say that they were a better live band. I mean, they could generate a lot of excitement in their concerts, but as a Stones fan, I've more or less always preferred their records to their live performances. I think Mick singing is a little bit out of control when he's doing live concerts. But anyway, this isn't really a video about the Stones. But seeing as there's always these endless comparisons. So, that was the Beatles as musicians. So, I think John is not known as the greatest lead guitarist in the world. He would admit that openly, but as a rhythm guitarist, as a driving force behind the Beatles, he was second to none. Paul's bass playing, again, very melodic, and brought out the best in many a Beatles tune. Outstanding. Ringo's drumming, absolutely perfect for what was required. No more, no less, just what was required for each particular song that the guys brought him. And George's guitar playing, well, he would probably get even better after the split with his slide guitar signature tune. But in the Beatles, you have some beautiful lead guitar work, and some of it quite minimal, and just supplying the right je ne sais quoi to a song like A Hard Day's Night, for example, when he does that minimalist solo. Or, I don't know, there's countless others where George is just playing a little riff here and there, and it's enough to lift the song. I Feel Fine is another. So, thank you for watching, and see you next time.